Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today we have a special episode in store for all our listeners. Joining us is the founder and CEO from SageWerks, Doug Shannon. And for some of you that are unfamiliar, it stands at the forefront of our evolving energy landscape, pushing the boundaries and ushering a new era of grid modernization. And it's one of my favorite topics, and I'm always slightly cautious of talking about it, but we're going to explore the concept of transactive energy. So Doug, I'm going to throw it over to you. Give yourself a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited. Yes, I'm Doug Shannon, CEO of consulting company. We do energy consulting. As the name implies, SageWerks kind of came from Skunkworks. I do a lot of work with a company called Faith Technologies and NTech. We do all things microgrids, virtual power plants, EV charging depots, in front of the meter, behind the meter. So very involved. Got to have a transactive platform in order to pull all that off. So I'm excited to talk to you about it today.
Yeah, and so in today's episode, when we're going to really talk about really how we produce, consume, and interact with energy, right? And we're going to dive into, I think, is the most exciting part of what we're doing, and it's like the definition of our new energy economy. But before we get into all of it, I'm just going to take a moment, lay some groundwork for any new listeners of why we are where we are and why this topic is even, pertinent to where we're all headed. So for all of you, remember we have an electric power grid. It ultimately has been designed and created over the last 100 years, but on the fundamental designs that were available in the turn of the century. We have a 4-part grid where we have bulk generation, transmission, distribution, and then our customer, the edge. How the electric power grid has worked throughout the last 100 years has really been transporting those electrons, one-way power flow into our customers and our large commercial industrial customers' homes and buildings. And from the phenomena of how electricity flows, its least resistance. And what we have done is created an energy market for the bulk transmission as well as the power plants that we all know and love. Where we're headed, and this is a lot of talk, is around distributed energy resources. At the edge of the grid, there's a new phenomena where energy is being created from a decentralized place. So how are we going to start dynamically understanding and using energy, right? So I'm going to throw a real softball over you, Doug, for you to explain what is transactive energy to you.
Yeah, I've heard the term bounced around for over 5 years. Everybody's got a different definition. If anything, to me, it's just a new approach to managing interactions between, as you mentioned, energy producers, consumers, prosumers in a decentralized digital landscape. And I know that's a big, long definition, but basically transactive energy to me is the new platform that allows these two-way transactions. You mentioned it was coming from generation before, got to a person's house, they got a bill at the end of the month, the utility bill, that was the transaction. And now with decentralized assets, right down to the consumer is becoming a prosumer, or somebody who can consume and produce energy. And that production might be in the form of solar, battery, their car. And then that will all be hooked together by a home microgrid system or a business microgrid system. And there you have a DER. And that person can now transact with the grid in a more real-time manner. And that transaction is going to need a platform to happen, and it's going to need a transaction that can be cleared, and it's going to need to be traffic control at the same time. So that's the basics of transactive energy to me.
And I think it's really, and we've talked about before in a lot of our conversations where, one thing that I think we're both very passionate about is really history and understanding, where we've been and to really understand where we're headed. And so like the whole topic of transactive energy is somewhat of a touchy topic to speak of unless you have the foundational statements that you just provided. So we're talking, really about the whole evolution of a new energy economy. And so when we talk about history, one thing that we get into, which I think is exciting to talk about here, is you explaining, what is game theory and how does that play into the bigger picture of what we're talking about here in transactive energy?
Yeah, I mean, if I backed up for just a second, in order for there to be transactive energy, and there's a bunch of good reasons for it, right? There's challenges and opportunities. The challenge is that it could disrupt the grid. The opportunity is that it could become an asset to the grid, all these DERs. And so, they are non-wire solutions. And but basically, these decentralized assets they're coming at us, and there's no stopping them.
Let's take a moment. Like when we say decentralized assets, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so as assets, these DERs, distributed energy resources, call them what you want, but it could be anything from a solar panel to a vehicle, to a school bus, a battery, to wind generation, and any kind of on-site generation or storage. I would call a decentralized asset. You're going to need two things to interact with that. You're going to need more than two, but the software is basically the DERMS management system that is on both sides of the meter. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit, I think, today when we head towards game theory in general. But there's another piece. There's the communication piece, obviously, where all these intelligent devices, and be it the whole way from the ISO to the utility to the virtual power plant aggregator, clear down to the vehicle to the person's cell phone. So when we talk about the transactive energy today, all those devices have to communicate in this sort of game in order to clear this new transaction. And so I would say that when you talk about DERMS, and you hear a lot about that term, these DER, distributed energy resource management systems, and they're going to contain auto agents, which are AI agents on both sides of the equation, bidding and offering for this price of this energy, based on a couple of different values. That the prosumer, like if I'm a home person or a person with a school bus, I'm trying to maximize my value. If I'm the utility, I've got a couple of different things to maximize. One is grid stability first and foremost, and power flow and all of that, and then value. And so that becomes a game that must be solved for, and that's an algorithm that's going to do that, and that's running the auto agents that are clearing these transactions. And so you'll need a platform for that, much like the stock exchange. But instead of having stock brokers, you're going to have software do this, because it's going to have to happen so fast and in real time. And so, I mean, your question was, what is game theory? And, I look at it as a technological framework and basically a mathematical language to describe how two or more agents or human beings are going to act in a situation that contains rules and outcomes. And so you could start to see where the utility and different folks are going to set up the rules and outcomes of this game as they would like to see it. And then you're going to have a mathematical language that can solve for these transactions. But this goes clear back to Plato and Socrates, talking about how humans are going to interact. And that's really, you fast forward the history, when you talk about the history of it, to 1944. If you fast forward, it was Newman, a mathematician, and Morgenstern, an economist, who came up with a theory of games and economic behavior. And they basically were trying to put mathematical equations to the probability of situations happening between two individuals. So that's your start of the algorithm of is somebody going to agree to trade in the energy, and then you have equilibriums that you're trying to reach. So Nash and Stecklenberg later on created equilibriums where eventually the negotiation or the game will come to an equilibrium. Somebody will say 8 cents a kilowatt, somebody will say 12, and then 9, 11, and the equilibrium will be reached at 10 cents. And so fast forward to today, these are very complicated algorithms, and they're solving in an order too. There's the utilities in the first order of this game, so they get to set the rules of the game from the beginning based on the grid and grid stability. and then the others will follow.
And I just
Go
want
ahead.
to, when you think about the utility perspective and how this phenomena that, we
Yeah.
understand that there's always transactive transactions happening between two entities in really everything we do in life. And how the grid evolved is when there was not the capability or the innovation, right, the technology that could bring information between two devices rapidly. So when the grid was being developed, the telephone system was also being developed. And so how the grid was designed is literally that delayed, latent communication between one device to another to respond. But us as users of those electrons, we were very predictable, and we kind of knew when we were going to turn lights on and when we were going to turn them off, and we could design the grid to be that way. So I guess I just want to connect all of the dots that we've been talking about in a lot of our other episodes to where we're going to go to the relevancy. But what creates us as humans to behave differently is typically understanding how we could possibly save money or gain or enhance a pain point, right? Like fix something. With all of that new, as you call them, assets, that is all of the new grid edge technology that's showing up on the grid. So it's not going to happen, it is happening. So there's lots of use cases where what you're talking about is in reality what is happening, and quite frankly is what drove the utility industry to develop something like FERC Order 2222, where you're now seeing that if we could adjust the human behavior based on price points of how they use energy, we could really design and plan and operate the grid differently. But I think that's and you probably agree, right? That's the inertia that's occurring right now. Everyone's kind of having these aha moments, and hence why we need to install the technology to gather the data, to run those beautiful algorithms that you spoke of, to even start having this engagement with our energy use.
It wasn't too long ago that vehicle to grid way off in the future, right? So that begins the two-way kind of scenario. The first one was demand response. That's the first kind of we can send out a signal and an incentive, as you said. We can incentivize behavior, and so that was the beginning of it in the simplest method. But now, these school buses and fleets are going to be vehicle to grid. The cars are going to be vehicle to grid, and you can move them around. So you, as the grid planner and kind of your derms on your side, set incentives and say, hey, this feeder is going to be in trouble with predictive analytics tomorrow at this particular time. You could pay more, incentivize people to go there and unload their load. So I think you're going to have cars moving around, for instance, that could go to a bookstore, and it might be a place where tomorrow they can go sit for an hour and make $30 to vehicle to grid to that particular bookstore or next to that particular substation. And so yes, it's coming. It's here. The equipment used to be, a lot of people talked about the equipment wasn't there. The equipment is getting there, and it will get there on your side as well. But it's coming right now, and I've seen even worked with you before on things. A lot of it's modeling. They want to model what will happen when 100 cars and 100 homes with solar come on, and so the modeling is just as important right now for the feeders and for your grid planning as to what you're going to do. But it does, in the end, one of the benefits for you, I'm sure, is that it could potentially save money in assets where that's why it's non-wires. You don't build another wire. You don't build more generation. You potentially use this load that's moving around, that's mobile, especially with the cars and the fleets, that you can direct and incentivize to different areas. And people are looking to make money. They're like, hey, I'll go sit at the bookstore for an hour tomorrow and make $30
Right.
because I charged on my solar panels. Yeah.
There's a part of me intuitively, no one's going to do that. But when you think about it, before there was Uber, did we really think that a bunch of humans would sign up to use their personal car to drive around strangers, right? It was such an idea that wasn't even really aware. And then there was a pain point.
Yeah.
And then, Silicon Valley ultimately created the algorithms and the technology to drive that change in human behavior. in a positive way. And I think it's another thing about transactive energy. It seems so, and also another buzzword in the industry is artificial intelligence. Like, is it going to create this thing that is no good? And yes, we have to be aware of it, but I think because we have assets that are already in plant and energized and being used and must maintain safe, reliable, affordable power, it doesn't mean this cannot happen. It just means we have to better understand like where we want it to go. And so you mentioned it, we cannot build the grid fast enough to meet the demands of electrifications that's occurring. So we must start looking at our customers as an asset to the overall grid performance. And so that is looking at the buildings and the vehicles and all of the different technologies that can be more or less going from that very centralized grid that we know and understand and love, and really some of us can't think outside that box because it's just too challenging. And also the models, aka the energy models, to really provide value are not there yet. But we can break down the distribution grid into these pockets. And so I just wanted to kind of bring our listeners along. There are use cases where this is occurring in many communities and various utilities across our space. And so we're learning from it. It just isn't really profound and known, but that's where we're headed. So very exciting topic. So in regards to tying it to the grid mod pod, how do you, bring it all together, Doug? How do you, that transactive energy and the game theory really, and then life, right? We've kind of touched on all of that. Comes together for you.
Yeah, I mean, everything we do, you know it better than most. There isn't anything you touch in life that isn't, have energy involved in it. That to get anything done physically or mentally, there's
Right.
energy in it all. So for grid modernization, obviously, transactive energy enables this paradigm shift from centralized to decentralized. So you have to have this platform, just like you had to have Uber to allow people to use their cars or Airbnb to allow people to use their houses. Now you're going to have this next transactive platform, and I believe there'll be several of them to allow you on your phone. It's like to transact with your assets that you now own as a homeowner or a business owner. So transactive energy will enable the paradigm shift. I think game theory enables transactive energy. So you can't have all this predictive analytics, like you said, on behavior, which is really what this is about, like human behavior. These things are going to be running all over the city, and you need to know where they are, when they are, and match them up with your needs, and then create incentives around it. So it's a very elaborate game that needs to be performed in real time. We're not buying energy in 3-year increments or energy contracts for 2 years or 1 year or 24 hours. It's by the minute. And
which is how the market is ran right now.
That's where it's going to so that's where transactive energy, game theory, they go hand in hand. They're going to be there for this paradigm shift. They're happening right now. I can tell you, we have software, we have the hardware. But it's like you said, it's in pockets. And when it gets used at a larger scale across an entire utility to the tune of millions of people, that's when people will really wake up and see what is possible. In terms of life, I know that in addition to you being a doctor and running a podcast and having a family and working high up in the industry, you're a life coach as well. And we've talked about that before. And I say every day humans generate energy, just like they're a generation plant. And you can generate more energy by working out more or eating right or sleeping better or meditating or whatever. And so you generate this energy, and then you're going around and trading it off during the day, much like transactive energy. You're giving it to your spouse or to your kids, and you're giving it to projects at work. I think you can pick, and you have to pick where you're going to put your energy. It's a finite amount of energy. And who are you going to trade it with? Or they always say the more you give, the more you get. And I think that that's true. When you put your energy into people and projects, it comes back to you. There's also people that can pull energy from you all the time. And so I think we have to be careful of our transactions. And if we looked at it like that, life is a game. And, game theory was meant to deal with interactions between two people. And so it's a game every day. I hate to say it, with your spouse, with your people you work with your kids. and life is short, and you got to make the most of it. So I say put the most energy you can into the most important thing, make the right trades. But I like the saying that you had one time is, you stay plugged in. You got to stay plugged in, because if you're not plugged in, and I don't mean plugged into the wall or plugged into your phone or plugged into your computer, I mean plugged into people. And you got to stay plugged in to play the game, and you got to stay engaged. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's how I think of it.
And I guess to tie it all together, and I think a big, thing I speak of and talk about on this podcast is, we understand the what we have to do from the physicality of the grid, and really the why, because we have all this new innovation and it wants a place to play on. But the really important part is the who as us as people showing up to ensure that we continue to create, the energy source for all, which is a big change, right? So like who best to help facilitate that transformation is the utilities that currently own the assets, because until we have electrons that can freely flow and be zapped into a box in your backyard, there's going to be lines that the electrons have to flow on. So like who we show up as a person as our best self, especially in this industry, to really think differently, be the innovator, be the change agent, I think is the beautiful part that we should talk about more, even though, we can get real techie real quick, but the why, and then really that who's doing it and how are we doing it. And I think the how is embracing data to create these platforms to enable, the things that we've just talked about. So, wow, see this, I knew we were going to go here. What an insightful conversation. So just to recap, just for some of our listeners, we delved deep into the world of transactive energy. I think it's going to be more written about and engaged and driven forward because, as you said, the hardware and the software is there. Now we need to get the who's to understand the how to start implementing it into our grids, right? So it has the potential to, it is the potential to transform the way we think about and engage energy, right? So the new framework is going to bring about systems that will drive efficiency. It will redefine the relationships between like our producers, aka the energy producers, those the consumers, and then also now the consumers that are becoming prosumers. So we used a lot of words that I think trip a lot of people up, but that is what will happen from a decentralized and digital landscape. So more to come, right? Yeah, you want to touch on the game theory, and then we can wrap it up.
No, it's a lot. It is. There's going to be peer-to-peer trading. And so, think of it like at some point you'd be able to help your neighbor out or help a neighborhood out, with your asset. And so it is a more peer-to-peer market. I think the utility, to your point, has been the leader back in the day with the old system. They need to continue to not be afraid to take that position of leadership right now, because they get the first mover advantage in that they should be the ones determining the stability of the grid mechanically across it, and therefore, put out the needs first, and everybody follows sequentially in the game. And so they have to take a leadership position. The assets will be out there at their disposal.
Yeah. And just thinking about, a reminder, like the grid is built upon the beautiful language of mathematics, right? And it's the backbone of everything that we need to do. So it's an intricate dance of, what are our values? What is the strategy? And then really, again, what is that energy transaction? Not just the electron flow, but the individual people to people stakeholder engagement. So with that, I wanted to say a massive thank you to you, Doug, for your invaluable insight and really bringing this conversation to the table. It's one of my favorite, and you always kind of have to tiptoe into it, but I think we're at a position where it's at the cusp of what everything we're really talking about. So as always, stay plugged in to the ever-evolving world of energy, and I look forward to being on this journey with you.
You too. Thank you very much again for having me.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.